Ban Ki-moon's term is almost up, and for the first time in its history, the United Nations is conducting open interviews for the job of Secretary General. It's a bid to improve transparency. But is the job more secretary or general? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, it's the most important role in international diplomacy. The United Nations Secretary-General heads up an organisation that's in charge of keeping the peace around the world. The role is appointed by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security Council. And for the first time in the organisation's 70-year history, candidates vying for that position will have to answer questions in open hearings. And also for the first time, a woman could become the Secretary-General. Of those who've put their names forward so far, half of them are women. Well, the UN says it hopes to make the selection process more transparent. General Assembly President Morgan Zlikoff said the old selection process was archaic and adds, "But recent changes to the process itself provide us with a genuine opportunity to make it more transparent, more robust, more inclusive and ultimately more effective." So what challenges will Ban Ki-moon's successor face? The first could be finding a solution to the global refugee crisis and to resolve the rising tension within the Security Council over the war in Syria. The new Secretary-General will also need to clean up the UN itself. There have been accusations of bribery and sexual misconduct by UN peacekeepers. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Shashi Tharoor. He's a member of the Indian Parliament now, but he was a candidate for the UN Secretary-General. And I started by asking him what he thinks makes for a good Secretary-General.
Well, I think that there's a big difference between what perhaps one might ideally want to see in a good Secretary-General and what the big powers want to see in a good Secretary-General. The two don't always match.
This is my point. So tell us ideally what you think would make for an effective world top diplomat.
It's an almost impossible job description. You need somebody who understands the various aspects of the United Nations work, which involves everything from humanitarian action to international politics to peacekeeping, which are the big ticket items, as it were, plus a talent for administering and managing a vast and complex bureaucracy, plus the diplomatic skills to work with governments and to work with dozens of heads of agencies under him or her. And finally, the skill to communicate the larger vision of the organization to the world as a whole and to inspire both his own staff and the publics of the world that these goals and this vision that he has sketched are worth fulfilling and that he deserves their support in fulfilling them. It's an impossible job description in many ways, but perhaps not impossible. There could have been individuals who might have fulfilled it, and many would name Dag Hammarskjöld and Kofi Annan as two who did strike the right mixture of qualities. But by and large, what member states, the powerful member states, the permanent five on the Security Council, are looking for is really a somewhat different animal. They certainly look for competence and someone who can manage the organization and deal with governments, but ideally they want people in the notorious expression who wouldn't make waves if they fell out of a boat.
Oh, so they would like somebody who was more secretary than general.
Most definitely, yes. They would definitely want somebody more secretary than general, and they would be the ones dictating to the secretary.
Is it possible to get a strong, independent, fearless Secretary-General given the control that is exercised by the permanent five? Is it possible to have, with the current procedures, is it possible to have that kind of person, that strength of character in that position?
Only by accident, I would say, Martine. Both Hammarskjöld and Annan, I think, were not expected by those who appointed them to turn out the way they did. And that ultimately can make a big difference. There are others. I mean, someone like U Thant was acting Secretary General for a while after Hammarskjöld died in a plane crash. And as a result, they actually had a good sense of how he would function as Secretary General. And by and large, he did as they would have wanted. But there were moments on some issues, the Vietnam War, for instance, and the Egypt-Israel war, when U Thant surprised them by being...
We're talking historically here. Can we go to the more recent past, of course, in 2007, when you yourself were a candidate for the role of Secretary General? The Americans vetoed it. Why do you think the Americans weren't happy with you possibly taking this job?
Well, we only have the rather disloyal memoirs of the then American ambassador, John Bolton, to go by. He says, in as many words, his instructions were, "We don't want a strong Secretary General," quote unquote. Now, he's very proud of his successful role in fulfilling that mandate as he sees it. I'm not sure that that's fair to the person who was appointed, Mr. Barn, who probably wouldn't like to be seen as a recipient of this kind of backhanded compliment. And on the other hand, it is to some degree a reflection of the way in which the US at that point approached the job. I did hear from 2 or 3 very well-placed friends in the administration that the message that was coming to them was no more Kofis. Kofi had been a strong and articulate Secretary General who was able to appeal above the heads of governments to the world public. But I think when he made that statement that the Iraq war was illegal, I think that's when governments decided they didn't want to have another one.
All right, let's introduce our guests now. In New York, we have Carne Ross, the former British diplomat and founder of the advisory group Independent Diplomat. In Oxford, in the UK, we have Sam Daws, UN specialist at the University of Oxford and former first officer to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Also in New York, we have Thomas Weiss, Professor of Political Science at the City University of New York's Graduate Center and author of What's Wrong with the United Nations and How to Fix It. Welcome to you all. Can I start with you, Carne Ross? It seems very much as though the system as is designed to throw up a mediocre candidate, shall we say, the most mediocre, the most affable perhaps, but the least offensive character is the one likely to get the next Secretary Generalship.
Well, the system as it has been, that's certainly true, where the permanent 5 veto-wielding members of the Security Council have dominated the decision of who will be the next Secretary General. This year might, I stress, might be a little bit different because the General Assembly is trying to assert its power under the UN Charter to take on that appointment itself. It ultimately approves the appointment, and today they're holding hearings for several candidates for the Secretary General. But I have to say I'm not convinced that they're doing it in the right way to break the monopoly of the P5, as they're called, over the appointment, and I fear that we will have another weak Secretary General who won't be able to stand up to the dominant powers in the world.
And Sam, what do you think of this new bid for transparency that's being undertaken by the current president of the General Assembly, getting the candidates to undergo what sounds like an excruciating session of 2 hours, fielding questions from all members of the General Assembly?
Well, I think that ultimately the permanent 5 members of the Security Council will still be key to the choice of Secretary General. But I think what these hustings change is that in their consideration there will be a greater expectation that the competence of the successful candidate must be a criterion in their choice. And that competence is both being able to manage a large organisation, the competence in navigating multilateral politics, but most importantly, and this will, I think, come out of the hustings, the ability to voice why the UN matters to a global audience through the international media. In the 24-hour news cycle, that is increasingly important, and I think these hustings are a great step forward to putting candidates on the spot.
So, Thomas, it seems very much as though the next Secretary General of the United Nations has got to have charisma, has got to have top-notch communication skills.
Well, certainly communication skills are key given the 24-hour news cycle and given the UN's image, which is highly doubted in many parts of the world. However, the people who've come forward to date are not exactly communications specialists, and charisma would not be something I would attach to any of them, except the one who probably has the least chance, Mr. Guterres.
And is it important, I'll stay with you, Thomas, is it important that a woman is selected? We know about the geographical arrangement whereby it's supposed to be next taken by Eastern Europe. But what about the gender issue? Does it matter?
It certainly matters to many of us. There's a strong advocacy group looking to have, for the first time, a woman. However, after years of arguing against the geographical notions of geographical quotas, geographical necessities, I'm not going to sign on and say that it's absolutely essential that we have a woman. All things being considered, all things being equal, I would certainly opt for a woman. But the candidates who have thus far appeared, I would not support very enthusiastically.
And Sam, what do you think? In many ways, the UN is riven by these preordained quotas, by the geographical origin of a candidate, and these are the things that tend to occupy uppermost, are in the minds of those people who make decisions, i.e. the permanent five. Is this the most efficient way to bring about the most effective operator to go to the 38th floor of UN headquarters in New York?
Well, I think the UN system uniquely represents all 193 member states, so it's always going to have that dynamic. And for appointments to be legitimate, they need to take geography into consideration. But we do need to find the best candidate. We've had 8 men in a row, so I agree with Tom that it's time for women. We've never had a candidate from Eastern Europe. However, we have had 3 candidates, 3 successful Secretary General candidates appointed from Western Europe, 2 from Africa, 2 from Asia, and only 1 from Latin America and the Caribbean. So there is an argument that Europe as a whole, East and West, has had its fair share. So if there's no agreement on a candidate from Eastern Europe, then I think it could be opened up, and particularly some very strong female candidates from Latin America may decide to throw their hat in the ring.
Indeed, there's also Helen Clark, of course, former Prime Minister of New Zealand and currently head of UNDP, who's clearly got the administrative skills managing such a big agency. But she also is a very strong individual, and I'm just wondering whether this would attract the negative vote from the permanent members, the Americans or the Chinese or indeed the Russians. So
I think there's a growing sense, particularly in the UK and France, who are also permanent members of the Security Council, that we need a Secretary General who will act. And the present system did give us Dag Hammarskjöld and Kofi Annan, who, against expectations, turned out to be very dynamic and very willing to stand up to member states, however powerful, speaking on behalf of the UN as a whole. So I don't think it's as much of a bar this time round, but certainly the odds are for a candidate who doesn't ruffle too many feathers. But I think one thing that the husting will do is actually raise the profile of expectation that we have a credible candidate this time round.
And coming to you, Carne, is it really feasible then that you can get a strong enough individual, a person who's not afraid to say no to the United States, to say no to the Russians, or to say no to any of the other of the 5 permanent members? Is it feasible that you can get somebody rise to the top and get the job if they're prepared to say no?
I'm not sure that it is, because the P5 have already been discussing who they want for a long time and will settle on a particular candidate or maybe 1 or 2 fallback candidates who they prefer. We've never had a Secretary General who stood up against the P5. Let's be clear about that. This celebration of earlier incumbents like Kofi Annan and somehow that he stood up against the P5, this simply isn't true. On the cardinal issues that he confronted, like Rwanda when he was head of peacekeeping, he failed to pass on warnings of genocide, imminent genocide in Rwanda. On Iraq, he failed to stand up to the P5 at all until long after the war began, when he was pushed by the BBC to say that it was illegal. This is not standing up to the P5. We've never seen a strong, robust Secretary General who really says what needs to be said. I would love to see such a person, but I think it's kind of more by chance than by choice that we'll get such a person, somebody who almost flies in under the radar as a sort of affable pushover in the candidacy process, but then turns out to be much stronger once they're in office. I have no idea who that might be.
And Thomas, let's have a look at the current challenges then, the challenges that define our time and will definitely be in the in tray of the next Secretary General. We've got climate change, we've got clearly the conflict in Syria, we've got Yemen, we've got a whole panoply of issues which are seemingly intractable. The world has changed so much, hasn't it, since the start of the United Nations?
It certainly has, and transboundary problems have only increased, whereas the decision-making authority and the resources are still based upon nation states. So it's rather unreasonable to expect that we're going to select one woman or one man who's going to change all of that. However, I think there's much more room for maneuver by an independent, courageous, and visionary, let's use the word, Secretary General than many people think. I think it would really help, of course, if there were one term of 6 or 7 years rather than 2 terms of 5, which is actually one of the demands that's on the table. And I think that would actually help this person, whoever he or she might be, to make such decisions.
And Sam, reform of the UN itself is also an issue. It's an ongoing issue, isn't it? It's a bloated, many would say inefficient bureaucracy spanning 30 or so agencies, 40,000 employees. This is going to take somebody who can really deal with the bureaucracy, with the administration of the organisation.
Yes, the Secretary General faces a daunting challenge because of the centrifugal nature of the organisation, where many of the far-flung agencies actually report to their own boards. They don't report to him or her. Then there's the structural issues of how do you reform the Security Council to retain its effectiveness but to make it more legitimate for the 21st century. But I think the final piece in the puzzle is actually an even more challenging one, is how does the next Secretary General move the UN from not just being a negotiation among member states, but bringing in the private sector, philanthropy, local authorities, civil society, in new partnerships to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, human rights and peace. So actually going beyond the member state basis of the UN is necessary if we're going to solve climate change, implement the Sustainable Development Goals. But it's a long way from how the UN is structured at the moment.
And Carne Ross, we've just been looking at pictures of the former Prime Minister of Montenegro making his pitch for the top job. What do you think of this array of candidates that we have so far? There is, of course, a possibility that some late entries will occur, but we've got 8 people. What do you think of them? Just having a very sort of quick look down the list. We've got the Montenegrin former Prime Minister. We've got a Bulgarian, Irina Bokova, currently Director General of UNESCO, and the list goes on. What do you think of them?
Well, some of them are my friends, so it would be a bit difficult for me to talk ad hominem about them. All I would say is you really need a big, heavy hitter. Having been a P5 diplomat and seen in private how the P5 beat up the Secretary General, and it's not a pretty process, it's not nice diplomacy, it's you do what we want or we will get rid of you. You really need somebody who's used to dealing with heavyweights like Putin, President Xi, or of course the US President. And that person, I'm not sure, is on the list so far. I would love to see somebody like Angela Merkel, who has shown great dexterity in dealing with Russia, for instance, which is one of the main problems in the international system today, whose egregious behavior over Syria, but not only Syria, also Ukraine, has really been very destabilizing and disruptive. I would love her to throw her hat in the ring if German politics, domestic politics, were to allow. I fear that's a long shot, but that's the kind of calibre of person I would like to see.
And Sam, it is difficult, isn't it? Because as we're saying that the favourites do tend to be coming from the Eastern European region. Any one of those that might have upset Russia, say, for instance, on the issue of Ukraine and Crimea, for instance, they're not going to stand a chance, are they?
Absolutely. I think whether or not there can be agreement between the United States and Russia, who both have a veto over the appointment of the next Secretary General, whether we can get agreement on Eastern Europe will depend very much on the state of play in Syria and the Ukraine at the point that the ultimate decision is made. I think there are some stronger candidates among the 8 who have declared already. I think Helen Clark, Antonio Guterres, Vesna Pusic, and in particular Danilo Turk are all strong. But there's also some very talented people waiting in the wings, particularly from Latin America. You've got Malcora from Argentina, Michelle Bachelet from head of UN Women from Chile. You've got Holguin from Colombia. And you even got a Bulgarian, Kristalina Georgieva from the EU, who might step in, but only if Irina Bokova doesn't reach sufficient support in the Security Council and therefore steps down from being the Bulgarian candidate. So I think this is a process which will take actually quite a few months to unfold, and there may well be some surprises of other people entering the ring. I would also give strong support for somebody like Angela Merkel, who interestingly was brought up in the early years in Eastern Europe, so in East Germany. So she fits that criteria despite being the Chancellor of West Germany.
And Thomas, looking at the larger picture, of course, we've already alluded to it, but the fact is the UN today stands accused of becoming almost irrelevant, doesn't it, in terms of today's challenges. So there's a far bigger, more existential challenge ahead for the next Secretary General, whoever gets the job.
That certainly is the case. In fact, the UN system is basically an ODA-driven system. It's a foreign assistance-driven system. And that number has been going down, not in absolute terms, but going down in percentage terms. The UN itself only accounts for about 5% of such expenditures worldwide of multilateral assistance, which means that unless we get better value for money, that the system will still continue. We don't get rid of institutions, we never do. But 5 or 15 years from now, it will be a relic and much diminished institution, very, very different from the one that was imagined in the period 1942 to 1945, when the United Nations was not just an alliance to crush fascism. It certainly was that, but in the minds of people sitting around tables, not just in London and Washington, but also in Delhi and Beijing and parts of Latin America, saw that multilateral institution would be key to future peace and prosperity. That all fell apart, of course, in 1945, but that vision is still very much around, and I think that there's more room for moving toward that vision than many people think.
And Carne, clearly the UN is in crisis. What does it need? What kind of injection does it need? It can't be business as usual from what we've been hearing. What does it need to make itself relevant and to actually become an effective multilateral institution as it was intended to be?
Well, that's a long story, but I think leadership is certainly one thing, though I do have some sympathy with the critics of those of us who think that a strong Secretary General will be the answer, who say it's some kind of redemption myth. It's clearly not going to be just a strong Secretary General who can fix the UN. I don't think reform of the Security Council is particularly important. Having a larger Security Council with more veto-wielding members will in some ways make it more sclerotic, less effective than it is today. I think one very simple reform would reflect the nature of the world today. Top-down institutions are not working. We need more bottom-up involvement. And the Security Council, for instance, extraordinarily often does not consult the people from the places it is discussing. Not just civil society groups, but also opposition groups, even governments of places like Kosovo when it was discussing that before Kosovo became independent.
I'm going to have to jump in,
That's a simple
Carne.
reform that anybody could institute.
It's a really good point on which to end. Thank you very much indeed. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Carne Ross, Sam Daws, Thomas Wies, thank you all very much indeed. And as ever, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like by going to the website aljazeera.com. For more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And our Twitter handle is @AJ Inside Story. So tweet us from me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha. It's bye for now.